hello, everyone. You know what time it is. It's 9:45 in the a.m. this gorgeous Wednesday morning, and it's time for Java with Jen, Java with Jen, Java with Jen, Java with Jen. Today I got my favorite because I went to Kent State University, a black squirrel. That was that was not a mascot, but we had them all over campus. It's from the poli-sci department. I just want to give a shout out to Kent State. Go Flashes! Yeah. Anywho, you can see I have a friend with me here in the neighborhood today. It's my dear friend and colleague, Allison O'Brien. I'm going to share with you her bio because it's dang impressive, and I don't memorize things for a living. But today's episode is going to be all about effective listening and effective communication. So Allison is a communication and leadership development consultant. She works across all levels from high potential individuals to C-suite executives. And she truly excels in working with teams who are stuck with unhealthy conflict, struggling with accountability, effective communication, and collaborative decision-making and or personality differences getting in the way. And I know, I'm going to say a side note and then finish up, that I have heard quite a bit now that we've moved to hybrid or remote teams, like the silos that have gone up and the lack of collaboration is something that I see across teams. So it'd be interesting to hear your take on that, Allison. Allison delivers training and individual coaching with a unique focus on the science. And you know how much I love science and neuroscience because I'm a geek, and geeks and nerds rule the world. Unique focus on the science of listening to improve communication outcomes. Thanks for joining me this morning, Allison.
Super excited to be here and chat with you and talk communication and all
Yes.
things
All
listening
things.
and collaboration and decision making and team dynamics and all that good stuff.
All that good stuff. Thanks for getting up extra early because I'm on the East Coast and she's in Denver, my old stomping grounds. And side note, Allison and I also share a love of cycling.
Yes.
Love to cycle.
Yes.
My favorite thing about cycling in Colorado was prairie dogs. Boop. Boop. They would just like, boop, pop their little heads up. You know, it's hilarious. As if they were listening to me.
Yeah.
See what I did there? Did a
Yeah.
callback to listening. So when we talked about coming together, we talked about having you on here, and we began to look at listening, what I loved was the way that you approach listening, or really the way that you approach leadership and why listening is such a key element of leadership. And look, we all know 2 ears, 1 mouth, listen more than you speak, except it doesn't mean you're supposed to shut up. I think it's intentional, focused, and strategic listening is really what I got out of our conversation. Do you want to just kind of give a little bit of an overview, like you gave me, of how you approach working with teams and specifically working with listening?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Jen. I think what's really important is to talk a little bit about what listening is and what it isn't. Meaning, what are some myths that we have around listening, and what does the science tell us that dispels some of those myths? So typically we believe, right, that you can tell if someone's listening, for one, and you can tell if they're listening if they're looking you in the eyes and they're nodding and they're encouraging you, and in their body language they look really engaged. What we know is that that actually is not an accurate representation at all of whether or not someone is processing the information or understanding your message, or frankly even paying attention in that moment. So that's one myth. We can get into that. But another is that there's good listeners and bad listeners. What we know from the latest research in listening is that it's a cognitive process, and listening is a brain-based habit, or the way that we filter information is habitual in terms of what we tend to pay attention into and what we might unintentionally filter out. So quite often when we say someone is a bad listener, what it feels like is that they don't understand or they're not paying attention to our message, when the reality is they could be picking up on something very different in that conversation than we are speaking to. So, and that gets into these habitual filters that have been identified in the research and the development of a listening assessment tool called the Echo Listening Profile. So I think those are two of the biggest myths around listening, good or bad, listening or not, and that you can tell by someone's body language whether or not they're actually paying attention.
I,
So,
I was actually thinking about that because I remember many, many years ago, like probably 30 years ago, 25 years ago, I realized how much I was not present
mm,
when I was being with somebody because I'd be like doing my grocery list or like
yes.
boop boop boop, look at the cloud or whatever it was. And so I began to focus not on what I was about to say, but I had this habit of focusing on every word the person was saying. And then when they stopped talking, whatever like trusting myself to just whatever came up then. Because I
Mm.
think and you tell me, is this one of the because you talked about habits that you identify in your work that when we don't, we are already forming what we want to say as the person speaking, which has us not listening anyway, and we don't even know we're doing it.
I think the cognitive habits that I was talking about are actually specific filters, and there are four
Okay.
of them. What and we can talk about those, but I think what you're talking about gets into how it is
Mm,
that we can be listening on some level, but also thinking about something else on some level and potentially even multitasking at the same time. So, this is really interesting. The average person speaks at a rate of about 125 to 150 words per minute. However, our brain has the capacity to process 400, 500 words per minute at a minimum, depending on what
okay.
study you look at. Some are actually upwards of 700 words per minute. So if you think about that,
Who talks
well,
that fast?
125 words per
No, no,
minute?
no. 400 to 700 words per minute.
Exactly. No one does.
The FedEx guy. Remember that the thing where like and then
But here's the thing. So if
yeah.
the average person speaks at 125 to 150 words per minute, but
Okay.
our brain has the capacity to process 400, 500 minimum, what's happening is we're using about 25% of our processing power when we are listening to someone. So our brains with that extra 75% can get really mischievous. We can start
Oh,
formulating other thoughts. We can start doing our grocery list. We can anything else. So we have to realize how prone we are to distraction when we are in conversation and really have the discipline to be very present and focused on the speaker.
yeah.
There's a trick to that. We are prone to distraction when we're not really interested, more prone to distraction. So we have to figure out a way, if we realize that we are distracted and that we are checking out, we have to figure out a way to become more engaged, to become more interested. Because when we're interested in something, way less prone to distraction.
Mm.
So
Okay.
we talk about listening to learn.
Okay, so say more about that. How does a person in a meeting, in a company, listen to learn?
Yeah. So it's really an intentional commitment. And we talk a lot about navigating a conversation to inspire deeper collective thinking. What I mean by that is asking really thoughtful, open ended questions because we're interested in learning something. Not because asking questions because we want our viewpoint validated, but asking a question that could potentially either shift our thinking or encourage the group collectively to have more valuable dialogue around a problem or an issue. So, that asking open ended questions that are really high quality that requires intentional, focused listening.
Yeah. And what would I mean, could you give us an example that of an intentional open-ended question? I mean, I love what you're saying, first of all,
Mhm.
and I have often said it really makes a difference if you come from curiosity rather
Yeah.
than certainty, which leads us to asking more questions. However, it doesn't necessarily give me the how to.
Yeah.
And what I hear you saying is that maybe there's a couple of questions or a question, a tip that you could give people, like, here's a great open-ended question when you're in a team meeting and you're discussing an idea. What would be a good
Yeah. So I'll give you a good example. Let's say someone's sharing an idea that initially to me either I disagree with
Yep.
or I don't believe is practical
Okay.
or I don't see the relevance.
Okay.
I might ask a question like, "Can you say more about how that is really important to you?" Or I could ask a question, "Okay, in a perfect world, what exactly would the outcome look like for that?"
Mm,
So instead of sharing my opinion as a rebuttal or my perspective as a rebuttal to someone's idea, I want to get more connected to their thinking. Right? So, what is it in that that's really important to you? Or I might say something, what was it in your experience, or what is it in your experience that has led to that perspective?
mm. And could you also, like, I'm thinking about, team meetings where with the women I work with, a lot of times they feel like people aren't listening to their ideas. And we have examples of that. It's sort of the age old example of I present an idea, nobody listens, a man presents it, all of a sudden it's a good idea. However, I'm trying to figure out what would be a great open-ended question. Well, let me park that for a minute. But going
Okay.
back to what you were saying, um, like a question for me, let's say somebody's presenting something and I can't quite track it with what our goals are. Share with me your thinking about why, what your approach is to us achieving this goal. It sounds like you have a new idea or strategy. Help me understand why you're sort of moving this way. I mean, I don't want to be like, tell me why you think you're right, but like what's a
Yeah.
better, nicer way to say that? You know what I mean?
Okay, there's 2 things in that. I love that approach, and I might suggest removing the word "why" and
Okay.
replacing it with "what." And here's so why do you think that?
Right.
Replace it with, "What has you come to that?" Or, "What is it that influences that thinking?" Here's why. We all have a bioreactive amygdala in
Yep.
our brain.
Yep.
Why is one of those words that can fire it up,
Yeah.
and we have a threat response. And in
So
that
it's like putting
moment,
someone on the defensive when you say why, like
or
challenging their
or their perception
right,
is that it's challenging. It may not be. The
right.
intention may be, "Tell me more. Help me connect the dots." But the perception of threat by the brain has that amygdala response. We enter into bioreaction. We can't think, we can't reason. So we've all been there in a
Yep,
meeting and someone
absolutely.
challenges our thinking and we immediately jump to conclusions. It's because I'm female. It's because they don't trust me. It's because they don't think I'm smart enough. When really that could have very little to do with it. But if we really want ideas or facts or linear thinking, we should avoid the why question.
Oh, okay. Because that like you said, it's a bio response, but it's also leads people to logical linear thinking in their response.
Exactly. If
So it
you
doesn't
ask
when you were talking about collaborative and creative communication, we want things that are gonna open up the brain, right, and get us pondering and wondering.
yeah,
Yeah?
yeah, I mean, here's a great example. Let's say you have a colleague that is, really fired up, and you say, "Why are you so angry?" Really different than, "What was it that happened that has you really angry right now?"
Yeah,
Really different question.
yeah. Because I feel like why it automatically puts the other person in the wrong or something, as if without you even meaning to,
Yeah.
you're seeing it as something they shouldn't be.
Mhm. And what the what question or the reporter questions, what, how, when, that gets us into more of that logical, fact-based, the what happened versus our explanation of what's going on.
I love this because, most of the time when I'm working with clients and they're super, super stuck, what I have them do is write down the story of why they're stuck, why they're, not why, but I say, I want you to write out the story of why you're
Yeah,
stuck, but I don't want to know why. I just want facts. Well, that's not true. I initially say, write down everything you're upset about, who's there, who's to blame, why this is happening to you, all
yeah,
the things, and then I go, "Now I want you to go back and just circle the facts. Who, what,
yeah,
where, and when. Why doesn't matter because why are the stories we're making up rather than just dealing with the facts." And when they do that and use that tool, all of a sudden it unlocks that brain pattern. They're like, "Oh my god, there's only 3 facts in my 2 pages of
yeah,
my 2-page missive," you know? But I
yeah,
hadn't thought about it as we're having a conversation, and I love that because it's a great reminder, and I also I think the key here is reporter questions.
yeah,
Reporters don't ask why. They wanna know what, how, when. Yeah, that's
yeah.
really, really great. That's really helpful for
I mean,
sure.
it's great in the workplace. It's really
Yep,
great outside of the workplace with the people that are most important to us,
yep.
that tend to trigger us even more sometimes.
I know, man. I'm going to see my folks for my birthday at the end of the month, and, my dad's, let's see, 87.
Yeah,
He'll be 88 in January. I'm not gonna have him around much longer,
yeah,
and there are times when I'm like a 6-year-old or a
yeah,
16-year-old getting caught, making out with the boyfriend in the basement or whatever, you know what I mean? And I'm
yeah,
like, "Oh my god, I'm a grown woman.
yeah.
What is going on?" So I love
I'll
it.
tell you, if you have teenagers, the one word you wanna remove from your vocabulary is "why."
"Why did you do that?"
Yeah. Oh, boy,
Oh,
do I have a great story on that, but we won't go there right now.
moms and dads, listen up.
Yeah,
Moms and dads and parental units, foster parents, whatever, yeah.
yeah,
Okay, so we have a few minutes left.
yeah,
One of the things I wanted to ask about, and I feel like we could talk for an hour, but I try to
we
keep
could.
these relatively short so people can literally have it while they're having their coffee. Um, Talk to me about a tip or a tool or a way to approach a meeting when you want to speak up. And well, actually, yeah, let's talk about this because we were talking about gender and how some people think gender plays into the questions, I think, or the
Yeah,
way we listen. And
yeah.
so you said that doesn't play into it.
We don't have any data or research that shows that there is a correlation between listening habits and gender. So we can't say that men are more analytical in their listening, women are more relational in their listening. We just don't have the data that
I love
proves that.
science. Thank you for saying that.
Mhm. What we know is that quite often the way that we share information is not always the way that our listeners prefer to receive information. So we want to make sure that we're really tuning in to what is it that our audience needs and then speaking into those needs. We tend to speak and share information the way that we prefer to listen for it and to it. So if I'm highly relational in my listening, I'm going to be really relational in the way I share information. And I will most likely talk about the human component more than anything that is data driven or validated or sourced. So we really have to know our audience. You
Mm,
touched on something, Jen. You said, well, what if you really want to speak in a meeting, right?
yep.
How do you do that and also either increase or maintain your credibility? You have an idea that you want to share, you want to speak up in a meeting. It goes pretty deep and there's a lot of complexity to that. But I would say to that individual who believes that they are not received in a way that feels respected or credible by their team, I would say, okay, observe yourself
Mm,
in a meeting, observe yourself in conversation. How often do you feel a real urgency to share your thinking immediately in the moment before it's gone for example. In that moment that you feel very inspired to speak up and share, I want you to pause and not say anything and listen
Mm.
for several minutes to see, is that idea that I so urgently wanted to share, potentially before it was fully formed, is it relevant to what we're talking about? Is it practical? Does it add value? Because if it's a really valuable contribution, it will still be really valuable in 5 minutes, in 10 minutes, in 20 minutes. It could be more valuable after we've paused a little while and let the conversation organically unfold a bit, hear more information that might support our idea, or in that moment where we're paused and we're really listening to learn, we might hear something that even shifts our thinking.
Mm. Yeah.
So we might actually decide, actually, no, I don't even think that anymore. I'm glad I didn't share it. So I think slowing down
Mm.
is the number one tip that I would give almost everyone in a meeting. We live in a culture that values speaking much more than it values listening. We are taught to speak, to advocate, to get our message across. We are not taught how to listen.
Yeah, we're not.
Mhm.
We're not. This has been such a great conversation. I want to have you back to talk about more at some
Okay.
point. Okay. But can you please share with our listeners if they want to find out more about you, where do they go?
Yeah, I would say go to LinkedIn.
Okay.
Look for me, Allison O'Brien. You can go to echolistening.com, learn a lot more about our model and echo listening intelligence. But yeah, reach out.
Do it. And I should say viewers. I don't know if people are listening or viewing. And I think, look, connect with Allison and follow her and see what else she's posting too. I think you always have such great insight into what makes a great team and
Mhm.
what makes great leaders. And you're right, we are a society that values speaking more,
Yeah,
and we're a society that wants results quicker.
yeah,
And therefore, we're so quick to speak up. But I think sometimes people will say, well, if I don't say it now, I'll forget it. Okay, write it down.
yeah,
Write down your thoughts about that.
yeah.
And I know for me, back before I had ever started using, side note, Clifton Strengths as the assessment I use with my clients, I had this uncanny ability to be able to, it's not uncanny anymore, but I had this uncanny ability to sit in a meeting, and I would sit in these coalition meetings and listen to like different people from different groups being represented, speaking about their opinions, their ideas, etc. And in my mind, I would, at some point raise my hand after a while and do what I like to call landing the plane. And people are like, how
Mhm.
did you do that? Like, I have this ability to hear a lot of different things and be able to pick out the through line. And then when I did my Clifton Strengths, which is totally separate and
Yeah,
distinct from the assessment that you're using, which doesn't focus on listening, but you can leverage it from that. But neither here nor there. One of my top strengths is strategic. So I'm able to
yeah.
hear patterns and data, but I never could name that. And I think what's really great is you don't have to have that strength to do what you're talking about.
No. And I heard two things in there, Jen. I heard one, you committed to listening. You rather than speaking, you were listening to the perspectives of everyone else in that meeting and were able to connect the dots and hear patterns.
Yep.
I call that conceptual listening,
Okay.
which is being able to hear patterns underneath the surface that are not evident to other people. So your pause, your patience, combined with that conceptual listening habit was magic sauce for you.
Yep.
Your superpower.
Yep.
Mhm.
And what's interesting about that, two quick stories. One is, growing up Jewish, I think it was like seventh or eighth grade, and we used to have, oh, what do we call it? Like there was like a Jewish youth group. and we would meet on Sundays after we'd go to Hebrew school or Sunday school.
Yeah.
And we had the speaker. And I remember he was so anti-Semitic, and I was looking around the room and nobody was saying anything. And I was incensed, and I got up and I don't even know what I said. I just remember this experience of like being lifted out of my chair and, speaking on behalf of everybody there. And as it turned out, he was faking the whole thing. The whole piece was to trigger us.
Mm.
And I remember being in the back of the room, like upset because I felt so foolish. And my girlfriend going, like, my best friend going, no, 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 don't worry about it. But I wonder whether that was a brain pattern that formed that had me listen more because I never wanted to feel foolish. There's no
Yeah.
science behind that. I'm just making a
I don't
supposition.
know, but what I would say is now that you know that, instead of the reaction or the bioreaction, once you recover your prefrontal cortex a little bit, right, that trigger
Yeah.
releases,
Yep.
what would be the question that you would ask that's open-ended in front of the group
Mm.
that proves you are listening, you have credibility, you are thoughtful, and it's to inspire deeper thinking?
I think I would ask, what have your experiences with Jewish people been that have led you to these conclusions? Or have led you to these viewpoints? I'm curious I'm curious, that phrase is one I often give my clients
Yeah,
because I think it stop like, okay, I'm curious for me is like a stop in the action. Right. I'm
yeah.
supposed to be coming from I'm curious. What have been your experiences with Jewish people that have led you to these viewpoints? That's something I could definitely ask.
And I'm curious works really well if it's genuine,
Yes.
right? If it's authentic because
Yeah.
you really wanna learn. Every now and then you come across people that say, "I'm curious," but they really want to hear
Right.
something to validate
Yes.
what they
I'm
think.
curious why you don't agree with me. I'm curious why you don't think I'm the bee's knees, which, by the way, bees
Well, I
don't have
do.
knees, I found out yesterday.
Okay.
So why do
Well,
we say bee's knees if they don't have knees, Allison? Is there science that
I don't
looks
know.
at that?
Yeah.
Yeah. The final thing I'll say is that I remember another story where I was working in the same coalition and I was in a room of funders of all these foundation people talking about an environmental issue on native land. And they're talking about solutions. They're doing all this stuff. And I was just quiet the whole time. And one of the leaders looked at me. They were like, Jen, you've been really quiet. Why don't you, what do you have to say? And I'm like, well, and I said, I'm curious because I really was. I said, I just don't, I think I said, I just don't get what I don't understand and help me understand this is why we're talking about solutions for Native people when there's not one of us who's Native at this table. And they're like, and we're going to break for lunch. Okay, but they switched it up. I mean, that has always been my go-to is like, if you're going to talk about from a social justice or any all the campaigns I worked on, we need the people affected at the table. Like that's
Yeah.
really important. And we need to listen to them
Yeah.
also. Well, Allison, it's been so fun to have you on Java with Jen for My Black Squirrel. Thank you this lovely morning. And I
Yeah.
wish you and everyone else a lovely day. And we bid you adieu. Again, reach out to Allison, connect with her, connect with me if you haven't. Follow us. We don't mind it. We don't think it's stalky. You can follow us. We don't care. Turn on the bell, ring the bell, and then also say your website again, echolistening.com.
Echolistening.com.
There you go. All right, friends, this has been Java with Jen. Java with Jen.